But amidst the rubble of the military strikes and the charred remains of the nuclear labs, a new and even more disturbing reality was emerging. While the public was focused on the known sites like Fordow and Natanz, intelligence agencies were beginning to leak information that suggested the strikes had uncovered something the Iranians had spent a decade hiding. Deep in the Semnan province, at a location known in whispers as the Rainbow Site, the initial damage assessments revealed something far more advanced than simple uranium enrichment. This 2,500-acre facility, operating under the cover of a chemical company, was holding secrets that would render the previous negotiations obsolete. The world was about to learn that the true nature of the Iranian program was much further along than any inspector had ever dreamed, and it all centered on the secret evidence found in the ruins of the Rainbow Site. Why is this moment historic? Because it represents the total failure of indirect diplomacy to restrain a state determined to reach the nuclear threshold. The IAEA reported that by May 31st, Iran had amassed a record amount of military-grade enriched uranium with no credible civilian purpose. We are talking about the capacity to produce multiple bombs on short notice. The legal battle over enrichment was not just a technicality. It was a fundamental disagreement over sovereignty. The U.S. insisted that for Washington to believe Iran was not seeking weapons, the facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan had to be dismantled. The Iranians countered with a three-step plan involving the release of frozen assets, but the gap was unbridgeable. This was the moment the world realized that the fantasy of total control over the Iranian nuclear program was either going to be achieved through a signature or through a bunker-buster bomb. As the smoke cleared from the initial June 13th strikes, the geopolitical map had been redrawn. The 62-day window of diplomacy had slammed shut, replaced by a ceasefire that felt more like a temporary exhaustion than a lasting peace. The regional states, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, were left scrambling to find a path to de-escalation, while the U.S. Armada remained positioned near Iranian waters, a floating reminder that the mission was prepared to be fulfilled with violence if necessary. The stock market had crashed, gold prices were soaring, and the threat of a global energy crisis loomed as the Strait of Hormuz became the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in a game where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of regimes and the stability of the global order. The world as we know it changed forever at exactly 12:01 a.m. on June 13, 2025. This was the moment the silence of the Iranian night was obliterated by the roar of the most sophisticated aerial offensive in modern history. Imagine the scene across the high-security corridors of Tehran, where the air was already thick with the static of rolling blackouts and the desperate humming of backup generators. For 60 days, a clock had been ticking. A clock set by a single, blunt document delivered from Washington to the desk of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Now, that clock had hit zero. This was not just a military operation. It was the final, violent collapse of a diplomatic house of cards that had been shaky since March. As the first reports of explosions at the Natanz and Fordow facilities began to filter through, the sheer scale of the event became clear. This was the outbreak of a full-scale war, a catastrophic collision between the United States' maximum pressure and Iran's maximum resistance. And the primary targets were not just concrete and centrifuges, but the very brains of the Iranian state. To understand why this moment is the most historic geopolitical shift of the decade, you have to look at the atmosphere in the 24 hours leading up to the strikes. On June 12, 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued a declaration that served as the legal death warrant for peace. For the first time in 20 years, the IAEA officially found Iran in non-compliance with its nuclear obligations. The wording was surgical and devastating, stating that Iran had repeatedly failed to address undeclared nuclear material and activities. Sources describe a tense standoff in the boardroom as the resolution was passed, essentially providing the international community with the justification for what was about to follow. In Tehran, the government dismissed this as politically motivated, but the tension was so thick it was palpable. U.S. embassies in Iraq and across the Arab world were already being evacuated. The UK had issued emergency threat advisories for ships in the Persian Gulf. The board was set, and the pieces were moving. Now picture the USS Abraham Lincoln. This massive aircraft carrier, described by President Trump as part of a terrifying armada, was positioned ominously in the region, a floating fortress of steel and fire waiting for the signal. The atmosphere was one of quiet dread. Inside Iran, citizens were following the contradictory rhetoric of a U.S. president who alternated between calls for a fair and equitable deal and promises of Operation Midnight Hammer, a total destruction of the Iranian state. While Washington claimed the Islamic Republic was at its weakest point since 1979, the streets of Tehran were a mix of defiant protest and simmering fear. One young woman spoke to journalists, her voice echoing the Supreme Leader's own refrain that America can't do a damn thing, even as others whispered about the terrifying lack of civilian shelters in a city of millions. The tension was not just in the air, it was in the code, as the government plunged the nation into one of the most severe internet shutdowns in history, disconnecting 90 million people in a desperate attempt to maintain control. The strikes themselves were calculated for maximum impact. Israel did not just hit buildings, they targeted the personnel that made the Iranian nuclear dream possible. In a coordinated wave of violence, the offensive killed top military leaders and the nation's most prominent nuclear scientists. Imagine the chaos in the operations rooms as reports came in that Ali Shamkhani, the political advisor to the supreme leader who had personally overseen the negotiations, had been injured. This was a decapitation strike in every sense of the word. The military objectives were clear: prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons by wiping out the human and physical infrastructure required to build them. In the initial response, Trump confirmed that the 60-day deadline he had imposed in his March letter had just expired, essentially giving the green light for the support of the offensive. The historical weight of this cannot be overstated. It was the definitive end of the JCPOA era and the beginning of a new, bloodier chapter. The documents that led to this moment were just as chilling as the missiles. On March 7, 2025, the letter that started it all arrived. It contained an ultimatum that was described by some as bullying, and by others as a necessary restoration of American greatness. The U.S. demanded that Iran fully dismantle its nuclear program, halt all enrichment, and end support for regional proxy groups within 2 months. The exchange for compliance was a promise to normalize relations. The penalty for refusal was serious military consequences. This was a 123 agreement on steroids, a high-standard legal framework that would have required Iran to give up its domestic enrichment entirely, a demand the Iranian leadership called excessive and outrageous. Between the lines of the diplomatic cables, you could see the Libya model being dusted off, a strategy of total de-weaponization that the Israelis had been lobbying for since the talks began. Sources describe the scene at the final rounds of talks in Rome and Muscat as a desperate telephone game. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi were often in separate rooms, with Omani mediators frantically relaying messages between them. The mistrust was a physical barrier. While the U.S. insisted on transferring Iran's highly enriched uranium to a third country, Iran demanded guarantees that the U.S. would not violate a new agreement as they had in 2018. The negotiations were taking place against a backdrop of rolling blackouts in Tehran, where the rial fluctuated wildly with every rumor. It was a race against time that everyone was losing. Behind the scenes, the U.S. military was building up a presence of 50,000 troops, while CENTCOM provided the president with a wide range of military options. The air was charged with the possibility of a massive conflict that would draw in the Houthis, Hezbollah, and the entire axis of resistance.